Hello, I'm Cara, and I would like to talk to you about Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring. And there are a few reasons that I'd like to discuss this. First off, it's very directly inspired by the podcast You're Wrong About. Um, First, because I love their show and their um, goal of recapturing, like untangling the truth of these important events and stories in our public life from the perception or the often very biased view that we took away from them as the public. And also, even more directly, because, in the format of their show, one of the hosts will research a topic, and the other will generally begin the show by explaining their understanding, which is usually the superficial kind of public story, which is often wrong, often what you know. And in one of their episodes, one of the hosts inadvertently played this role for me on the topic of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. So they're in their episode about the book The Stepford Wives. They're discussing a part where the characters in the book are trying to figure out what is causing the weirdness in the town in Stepford. And one of the characters thinks it could be something in the water. And so one of the hosts of You're Wrong About mentions that maybe Silent Spring had something to do with that perception that people were thinking about pesticides and different things. And they also said that Silent Spring had been, that it was about DDT, which is a perception that a lot of people have and is incomplete, and also that it had been largely debunked, which is not true, and I feel it in my heart. So yes, so that's what inspired me to make this video. And yes, another reason I want to talk about it is because, like, in the book she talks about DDT. DDT is the one that was talked about the most in the media and kind of had the most public response and the most kind of thorough legislative action taken against it. But she discusses a variety of pesticides and herbicides, that insecticides and herbicides that which she calls biocides. She is very careful to talk about, like, she's never advocating completely banning all pesticides, because some method of pest management is going to be necessary for humans living in dense populations, especially. But, the way we were using them, and still are in many ways, is harmful and dangerous. So a lot has happened since then. So this book was published in 1962, so 60 years ago. This is a 50th edition, or 50th anniversary edition. So this copy of the book is 10 years old. Another reason I want to talk about her is I found learning about Rachel Carson as a person. I've connected to her a lot and found her story inspiring, I guess, is one word, but also just kind of validating, because I see a lot of myself in her. She's someone who people often, if they're looking at this kind of segment of history and the population, often refer to as probably not being straight, which she never, because she had these intense friendships with other women, particularly with a woman named Dorothy Freeman, who was married to a man before she and Rachel met, but they wrote a huge amount of letters to each other that they did not let anybody else see, were extremely private, and they cared very deeply for each other. And then also, like, after Rachel passed away, Dorothy burned the majority of their letters, which, they're private people, and that makes sense. But anyway, on the subject of her not being straight, like, she never identified obviously as queer or as a lesbian or as not being straight. And I think one of the things that we have learned or should be learning from the queer liberation movement is that we have to let people identify themselves, to pick the labels that work for them and not try to assign them any that don't. So I think it's important not to, give her labels that she didn't take on, but it's also important to recognize that the reason we never had an opportunity to learn that about her because of the society and the time that she was in. She would not have been safe in a variety of ways for her to identify that way. So it might be true, but she might not have been straight. But anyway, but regardless, she stayed single with these intense, deep connections with other women. And I personally, as a woman who is single and also lives with cats, as she did, but I'm someone who falls in love platonically and romantically with other women frequently, but also at the end of the day, like, I just really like being single and thinking about my own creative projects and hanging out with my cats. So I feel very connected, very connected to some aspects of her, whether or not we are on completely the same wavelength. So I'd also like to try and connect her story and her work to the larger context as a tool for us now to appreciate what this work meant when it was written, when it was published in the 60s. And also, I'd like to try to add a little more wider context in space and time, like think about other cultures and places and throughout history, kind of contrast what she says with some other approaches to the world a bit. So first, excuse me, I want to talk about who she was before she wrote Silent Spring, which she and her friends referred to as her poison book. And some of her friends, I remember particularly Dorothy Freeman, did not love that she was writing this book because it was very stressful. But anyway, who she was to the public before this was a beautiful science writer who especially wrote about the sea. She was from Pennsylvania. She loved the ocean. She actually loved the ocean years and years before she ever saw it. But when she saw the ocean, she fell more deeply in love and continued to do research there. So she went to college in the 1920s. She initially was studying English and then switched over to biology. So she had a degree in biology and went on to get a master's degree. She studied especially tidal ecosystems and ended up working for I don't remember what the name was, with the previous incarnation of the Fish and Wildlife Service, mostly as a writer. And then she started publishing books. She published a lot of articles in magazines first about, sometimes about environmental issues along the coast in the Northeast, and also just communicated a love of the ocean and that ecosystem, and helped people to really connect with it. So on that end, I want to recommend this book. This is The Sea Around Us. It was published in 1951, and I actually, I don't know if you can tell that this book still looks brand new, but I have not read it. I found it as an audiobook through my library, and I highly recommend the audiobook version, because the person who reads it sounds to me like the grandmother fairy elf lady in Fern Gully. She just sounds gentle and wise. And this book is about, it's kind of like, it's a history, a story of the world, of the earth. So she starts on geologic time and takes us through the whole Earth's creation to the best of our understanding in 1951, which I think makes this just a wonderful book in a few different ways. She's a gorgeous writer, so you just kind of get drawn into this world of molten earth and steam and all the different, like, what it would have felt or looked like could we have perceived it at the various points in Earth's history. And also, like, 1951 is a decade and a half or so before the model of plate tectonics was accepted by the wide geology community as correct. Like, it hadn't been observed enough or proven enough to be accepted before then. So the explanation she gives for things like the formation of mountains are the best understanding we had before that. And I find that really lovely and fascinating, because it becomes a story in two levels. She's telling her best understanding of the story of the history of the earth, and it also now lets us see a story of our human understanding of it, which she discusses as well. And she does a lovely job of saying, I think at the best, the oldest rocks that we had identified at the time she wrote this were 2.3 billion years old. So that was like our estimate of the age of the earth. But she's clear that that's, as far as we know now, and we may find older rocks or other evidence of of how old the world actually is. And it's more like 4 billion years, as we know now in 2022. Anyway, so I highly recommend this, especially as, for me, it has been a wonderful bedtime audiobook, because it's just, I find it very soothing to think of the world on a geologic time scale, and to have this lovely, wise grandmother voice telling me about it, and to have this story told to me. So that's what she was known for. This was a bestseller. People loved her writing. So in 1951, she had another book that came out in 1955. I believe that was The Edge of the Sea, which was popular, not as popular as The Sea Around Us, but she was known as a science writer. That was what she really excelled at. And then towards the end of the 50s, she started working on Silent Spring, which, again, she referred to as her poison book. But the way that it was written, as the way that her previous books had been written, she was connected through her time studying in university, her connections to other scientists, and then also through this federal department of the Fish and Wildlife Service. She was connected to, she was up to date on a lot of research and connected to the people doing research, or could reach out to them. So she did. And So the book Silent Spring, each chapter is written in collaboration with multiple experts in the field of whatever she's talking about. So she has books about the water cycle, so rivers and groundwater, and cycling all through the earth. And the thing, yes, and then she talks about soil, and her chapter on the plants is called Earth's Green Mantle. She talks about birds, and then also about, it has a couple of chapters explaining explicitly pesticides, and then kind of goes through case studies in most of the chapters, which again, all of these, and each of the chapters was written in collaboration with multiple other scientists. So they shared their research with her, they read the chapters, they gave her notes on it. So this book is not just her opinion, it is her collation of the best understanding in the scientific community on these topics, which I think is an important thing to remember also. So I also think it's important to think about who she's talking to, who is she writing this book for, and that's, the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So I looked at some of the movies and TV shows that were popular in the decade before this book came out. So some of the most popular shows of the 1950s were things like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, Perry Mason, Superman, Howdy Doody, Father's Knows Best, which is the one that I hadn't heard of, but yes. And then I looked also at the Disney movies that came out the decade before, and they include things like Robin Hood and Pollyanna. So I think popular media, these popular stories that are being told, are a good way to get a feel for what we were thinking about, or how we were thinking about the world. And it's important to keep in mind too that in the 1950s, the United States was going through this great period we were very affluence after the Second World War. We were feeling very heroic. We were feeling very, very powerful, but then also threatened, because this is also the height of the Cold War. So, which is very relevant to the audience, to shaping the audience that she was writing this for, and to creating the world that she was writing about. Because a lot of our pesticides, a lot of the chemicals, including fertilizers, a lot of the chemicals that we apply, that we spray around our world, were first developed during the war effort, either as weapons, like chemical weapons or explosives, or various things. So World War II kind of put tons of money and research into the chemical industry, and then they were still riding that wave of affluence and esteem all through the 1950s. So chemists were very highly regarded, and very highly valued. And and it also being the Cold War, and after coming off of World War II, criticizing the U.S. made some powerful people, mostly powerful men, feel very, very threatened, even if, as today, generally people who are criticizing the way that we do things in the U.S. are doing so because they care and love this country and what it could be, and want it to reach that potential. Anyway, so what I'd like to do next is just read a section. It's actually a chapter, but it's a very short chapter. So her very first chapter is called A Fable for Tomorrow. And I want to say before this that this is, I think it kind of sums up what people were reacting to. Like, so we're keeping in mind that 1950s and early 60s culture. And I think that that reaction that people had then still defines the way that we talk about it now. Often even, like, I have degrees, undergraduate and a master's degree in environmental science, so I encountered this book a few times in my academic career, and often even the people who talk about how important it is and how good it is want to kind of undercut it for some of the reasons that might become clear in this chapter. So so before we go into all of the chapters that are very thoroughly researched researched on specific aspects, like specific slices, she wanted to set up her book with a fable because it's a short story that gets across the overall message, the overall thing she's trying to communicate. Okay, so this is Rachel Carson's A Fable for Tomorrow. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms, with fields of grain and hillsides of orchards, where in spring white clouds of bloom drifted above the green fields. In autumn, oak and maple and birch set up a blaze of color that flamed and flickered across a backdrop of pines. Then foxes barked in the hills and deer silently crossed the fields, half hidden in the mists of the fall mornings. Along the roads, laurel, viburnum, and alder, great ferns and wildflowers, delighted the traveler's eye through much of the year. Even in winter, the roadsides were places of beauty, where countless birds came to feed on the berries and on the seed heads of the dried weeds rising above the snow. The countryside was, in fact, famous for the abundance and variety of its bird life, and when the flood of migrants was pouring through in spring and fall, people traveled from great distances to observe them. Others came to fish the streams, which flowed clear and cold out of the hills and contained shady pools where trout lay. So it had been from the days many years ago when the first settlers raised their houses, sank their wells, and built their barns. Then a strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens. The cattle and the sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was a shadow of death. The farmers spoke much of illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. There had been several sudden and unexplained deaths, not only among adults, but even among children, who would be stricken suddenly while at play and die within a few hours. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. On the farms the hens brooded, but no chicks hatched. The farmers complained that they were unable to raise any pigs. The litters were small, and the young survived only a few days. The apple trees were coming into bloom, but no bees droned among the blossoms, so there was no pollination, and there would be no fruit. The roadsides, once so attractive, were now lined with browned and withered vegetation as though swept by fire. These, too, were silent, deserted by all living things. Even the streams were now lifeless. Anglers no longer visited them, for all the fish had died. In the gutters under the eaves and between the shingles of the roofs, a white granular powder still showed a few patches. Some weeks before it had fallen like snow upon the roofs and the lawns, the fields and the streams. No witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken world. The people had done it themselves. This town does not actually exist, but it might easily have 1,000 counterparts in America or elsewhere in the world. I know of no community that has experienced all the misfortunes I describe, yet every one of these disasters has actually happened somewhere, and many real communities have already suffered a substantial number of them. A grim specter has crept up upon us almost unnoticed, and this imagined tragedy may easily become a stark reality we all shall know. What has already silenced the voices of spring in countless towns in America? This book is an attempt to explain. So that's pretty dire. But is she wrong? She was not. And yeah, so talk a little bit about the response to her. So it quickly became very apparent to her that she was actually lucky by the time this came out, because she was a writer. She had been supporting herself independently for a number of years. So she was not directly tied to any university or any federal institution. And she realized that was very lucky, and that allowed her to continue doing this work because her funding, her livelihood was not dependent on any funding from chemical industries or other chemical companies or other entities associated with them. So the way she was talked about in the press was like pretty awful. Like some people are just kind of trying to deal with what she was saying, which is a lot. But she was also taught, like, one of the things that people, to my understanding, spoke the most about was the fact that she was unmarried and didn't have any children, which some people said proved that she was a communist. A lot of people just spent a long time talking about this fact and about how it didn't make any sense that a woman who was unmarried would care about chemicals causing, like birth defects, and which is one of the many things she talks about, causing birth defects and illness in children. Like, why would she care about genetic mutations if she didn't have any kids herself? Which is ridiculous, but something she had to spend a lot of time listening about. I don't know that she always answered it. And she ended up, this was a big deal, and she was taken very seriously, though, she was also attacked. But she ended up testifying in front of JFK's Science Advisory Committee, and then later a Senate subcommittee on her research and on her understanding of the use of pesticides and the impacts of them. And eventually, some of that, like some of the impact of this book, she gets credited with the passing of the National Environmental Policy Act, which formed the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So she did have a huge impact, but she was also, basically talked about as hysterical. Like, I think this kind of formed in some ways a blueprint. I'm not sure actually between the chemical companies she's talking about and like tobacco companies, which of those came first, but it's they and then fossil fuel petroleum companies on the subject of global warming all kind of seem to have a similar playbook where they support some small changes to make them look better, but also just raise as many questions as possible and raise as much doubt in the person giving you this information as possible, rather than investigating, trying to learn the breadth of the research and communicate the truth of that. They obviously, in their very self-interested way, want to just distract the public, and have been largely successful in distracting the public from these, I don't know if whistleblowers is the right word, but people calling alarms. So anyway, and I feel like that vibe, that feeling is still present in the way that people talk about her now. Even professors that I had who would talk about, like, make sure we read this book because it is important, but also be sure to clarify that they think the tone is a little much, or that she went a little far. And I think that in 2022, like, with the ongoing, you can learn more every day about chemicals that we're putting into our environment and the harm that it's doing us. I think it's pretty obvious that she was not going too far, and we should have taken her much more seriously. So, I mean, even as she was, and okay, so being the particular kind of nerd that I am, I like to think of, I have a metaphor for moral value using the physics definition of a vector, which means that something has both magnitude and direction. So, if that makes sense, is why I don't really like, or I don't think that intelligence is a very good way to measure someone's value, because your intelligence means you might have a large magnitude of impact in some way, but it doesn't mean that it will be good, right? And anyway, in physics you talk about vectors so that you can describe the movement of objects. So if you throw a ball straight forward, it will be moving forward, it will have that force on it, and it will also be moving down towards, because of gravity. So if its motion might look like this, you can divide it into the vector, if that makes sense. But I like that metaphor. It's incomplete, but because we can think about what she was putting into the world, the work that she was doing, and all the other directions that her work was being pulled, both explicit and implicit. Like, there are things that you can see in the response to her. There are things that shaped her knowledge and outlook as a white woman in America in the mid-20th century, that take her impact, that reduce her impact from being as complete as it could. And I think partially because of that, we end up kind of blaming her for the economic system that she was working in. Like, people want to say that this book was great, but it didn't fix the problem, which, like, one person cannot fix a problem on this scale, but in a different economic system, it could have at least come closer, because if we didn't have these big companies, in this case, chemical companies, these capitalists who own a lot and are very invested in protecting what they own and making more money over any other kind of value, everything, all the possibilities of what we can do get filtered through their interests and kind of dragged down. So maybe they're the gravity on all of our good intentions, I guess, in this system. So yeah, so her book didn't fix things, but like if we were in it did make a difference, but if we were in a different system where, people responsible for pest management did not have to have their ideas and policies filtered through the interests of capitalists, we could just have, kind of pest management people as a group take this into consideration and help us and them decide as a whole, as communities, when using what chemicals make sense, and if there's some chemicals that just never make sense. But we end up having to, filter that through the interests of people who just want to make sure that more things are sold so they make more money. And a lot of times there are better ways to do things, but they involve buying less stuff. And so they're not popular with people who can pay to have their voices heard. Okay, so the other aspect of context I want to talk about is the fact that she was a white American in the mid-20th century. So I'm going to start with, she starts with a couple of quotes. At the opening, this is Silent Spring again. So at the opening of her book, she starts with a quote from E.B. White. He says, "I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach to nature is to beat it into submission. We would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively instead of skeptically and dictatorially." She also, in her second chapter, which is kind of an overview, it's called The Obligation to Endure, Rachel Carson says, "Only within the moment of time represented by the present century has one species, man, acquired significant power to alter the nature of his world." So she's talking about how, we've gotten much more, the Industrial Revolution happened and we have a lot more power to change our environment. But I think it's important to remember that, we don't have to. So I need to still research. This is another thing that could be, I wanted to make this video, actually get it made and not wait for forever until I knew everything about everything. So I would like to make more videos in the future. But anyway, the indigenous nations who lived in North America before European settlement or colonization were managing the land. They were, I live in Iowa, which is in the Great Plains and the tall grass prairie, and it is an incredibly fertile and abundant landscape. That's why, now our state is almost all agriculture, but it was being managed before that. And I know there are early records of white pioneers talking about, coming through the tallgrass prairie, I think in particular, and in the Northeast, talking about how this is beautiful, like this landscape is perfect and pristine, and it's like a garden that God has made for us. And it's like, no, actually, it is just kind of a garden, like a permaculture garden that other civilizations already live in. So I think it's important when we talk about things like the impact of chemical companies and environmental damage, that we remember that we're not the only culture that has existed, and other cultures have dealt with these problems before, or not come up against them in the same way because they made different decisions earlier. Another example that I'd like to mention just briefly is China, like the country of China. I was going to grab a book. I have a book called The Retreat of the Elephants by a researcher named Mark Elvin, and it's a chronicle of the last couple thousand years at least of environmental changes caused by Chinese civilization. And I think there's a tie-in to another video that I watched recently, and really from a creator I really love, talking about Wu Zetian, who was the only female Chinese emperor in history. It talked about how Wu Zetian's father became rich under the last emperor of the Sui dynasty, by selling lumber, because this final emperor, whose name I did not look up, but the last emperor had all these huge projects. He wanted to be known through history for his great accomplishments. So he had all these huge construction projects that were devastating to the people. Like, a lot of people died trying to do the work that he was forcing on them. But also, I think it's interesting to remember that, like, there's never been a way for a family to get rich in one generation by selling a natural resource. There's never been a way to do that sustainably. There's not a way to be rich doing that now, and there wasn't in in ancient China. So and China has had huge engineering projects that have massively changed the environment for literally thousands of years, which is not to say that we're not in a unique global crisis right now with regards to the environment, to pollution and the climate. But I do think it's important to keep perspective that there have been other cultures with different answers to these problems, and other cultures who have run into some of these problems and fallen apart because of it. So things are unique. We're in a unique crisis right now, but it doesn't mean we don't have anything to draw on. It doesn't mean we're completely alone. And on that note, I just wanted to finish up with a few suggestions of things to do now, because I wanted this discussion to be informative and hopefully helpful and validating more than depressing. And I don't know if I've struck that, but I do think there are some constructive things to do now. And mostly they're to do with being connected to where we are now. Because you can, like, Rachel Carson, I didn't talk about the ending of her story. So I guess we'll do that now. Rachel Carson was dying when she wrote this. She was diagnosed with cancer I believe in the late 50s. She was undergoing chemotherapy and very brief periods of remission, but was getting sicker and sicker. So you can see in her testimony in front of Congress, she's wearing a wig because all of her hair had been falling out from chemotherapy. And I find this part of her story, I mean, obviously so touching because, like probably every human, I've known a variety of people who've had cancer in my family and other loved ones, some who have survived and others who have not. And of course there is no, any way that someone faces their own cancer is correct, right? There's no way that should look. Just trying to get through the day is more than enough. Like, I've dealt with illnesses that are have felt significant when I was going through them, but nothing like terminal cancer. And just getting through the day is enough. But I know of the people that I have known, some just tried to survive, which is, yes, more than enough, or to save up their energy most of the time so that they could connect with their loved ones at moments when it felt, when they had that energy reserve saved up. And I have known other people, I'm thinking especially of some women who have just put what could be or is the last of their energies on earth into loving their communities in various ways. And I think I really, I think that's one of the things that this book represents is she knew she was sick, especially in the last couple of years. She knew she was dying. So she died in 1964, just a couple of years after this was published. And she still put herself through this. She still put herself through the effort of researching and writing this book and the public scrutiny. And she knew a bit about, she had been in the public eye before, mostly positively and not to this degree, but she knew a bit about what she was getting into. Anyway, but so this is what she put her energy into. And she made a difference. She didn't solve all of our problems because one person can't. And the reason talking about my recommendations reminded me of that ending of the aftermath that I hadn't talked about, was because we can all, none of us, especially individually, can solve all of the problems, even in our town, even on our block, but we can all make a difference. So, so my suggestions are about, connecting and understanding what differences you can make, and then making them when you have the right energy and time. So the first is to connect with your local mutual aid groups. In Des Moines, we have the Des Moines BLM, which here is the Des Moines Black Liberation Movement, who does fantastic organizing, for activism and for mutual aid, and helps support a lot of people, a lot of members of our community who need it. I also think a good thing to do is to learn about indigenous nations in their history and present, because indigenous nations are still here, and learn about especially the cultures that are near you or historically were near you, because a lot of them have moved, especially in where I am in Iowa. We're a place where a lot of nations were forced to move here from the east or forced to pass through. So there's a lot of history to learn. And there are also current movements, current organizations and movements and people to support. So if there's anything, any way you can support the land back movement in your area, giving land back to the indigenous nations who were much better managers than we have been recently, I recommend doing that. I personally recommend following the Great Plains Action Society, who is based, I believe, here in Iowa, or at least started here, and do great education and activism around the Great Plains. My next suggestion, again on the topic of just connecting to where you are, is to open up Google Earth and look at the satellite view, and then I think depends what you might have to be looking at a desktop, but you can click on that and go back through a lot of places. You can go back through satellite images through the years. Sometimes it's multiple years, and then often you can get aerial photography from past decades. So if you just doing that, you can see what exactly has been in the place, in the literal place where you live, how recently their buildings were built, if buildings have changed, like if the environment has changed. And I love that as a way of connecting to your place. And I also, more fundamental to all of that, I do think it's incredibly powerful and important to just check in with yourself. And that sounds, I don't know, maybe flippant or like lighter, but I think that a lot of what are like the harm caused in our current way of doing things is from disconnecting us from the realities in and around ourselves. So instead of just being able to focus on the question of, do these pesticides make sense to use here in our situation, we also have to be inundated with messages about buying more chemicals or, whatever other thing. So I think it is really powerful just to check in with yourself. If there are any needs that you can meet, if you notice, just literally that you're hungry or you're thirsty or you need to stretch, I think that getting used to checking into your body and your place is a fundamental and an important step to being ready to doing all of this other work. And I deal with mental health, mental illness, and I'm not perfect at or consistent at doing any of these. So I'm not saying, I'm not setting out any of these suggestions as things to live up to, but the options that are available and things to try and see what works for you. So I think that's what I have. Thank you so much for listening to my rambly video. I'm going to put some links to resources and things that I mentioned in the description. I'm also going to put links of places you can support me if you would like me to make more videos, and maybe with more actual editing. I would really like to do that, and right now I just need to spend more of my time on things that are making money, sadly. So if you would like to support me in making more videos or other things, I have a PayPal where you can give me a tip or donation if you'd like, and I also have a Patreon, which is mostly focused on my earth science map fiber art. I do cross stitch, but if I am able to, if people are interested and I am able to start making videos more regularly, I'd love to be able to add some rewards around this as well. Anyway, so again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll talk to you soon. Bye.